Welcome to AI and the Future of Higher Education, a webinar hosted by the Graduate Center at the City University of New York. It is part of the 10th anniversary celebration series from the Futures Initiative, which was founded by Cathy N. Davidson. The webinar will engage the dual nature of AI and other machine learning technologies in academic settings, highlighting both their transformative potential and the critical and ethical concerns. The conversation will be moderated by Dr. Jade E. Davis and Dr. Kevin Healey. Dr. Davis is Associate University Librarian for Teaching, Learning, and Research at the University of Iowa and Regional Director of HASTAC, the Humanities, Arts, Science, and Technology Alliance and Collaboratory. Her research considers how humans are shaped, constrained, and mediated by social and technological forces. Her recent book, The Other Side of Empathy, was published by Duke University Press. Dr. Healey is Director of Experimental Pedagogies and Arts-Based Research for HASTAC, and he is Associate Professor of Communications at the University of New Hampshire. His co-authored book, Ethics and Religion in the Age of Social Media, was named Book of the Year by the Religious Communication Association in 2020. He teaches about media, religion, and ethics, and he is currently developing new methods for leveraging music, video production as forms of social critique. Thank you for moderating this important conversation, Dr. Davis and Dr. Healey.
And I'm happy to introduce our esteemed guests. Dr. Alondra Nelson is Harold F. Linder Professor at the Institute for Advanced Studies. From 2021 to 2023, she was Deputy Assistant to President Joe Biden and Acting Director and Principal Deputy Director for Science and Society of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, or OSTP. She led the development of the White House Blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights, a cornerstone of President Biden's executive order on the safe, secure, and trustworthy development and use of artificial intelligence. In 2023, she was included in the inaugural Time 100 list of the most influential people in AI and was appointed by United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres to serve on the UN High-Level Advisory Body on Artificial Intelligence following her nomination by the White House. Dr. Cathy N. Davidson is the founder of the Futures Initiative and Distinguished Professor of English, Data Analysis and Visualization, Digital Humanities, and American Studies. She is also the Senior Advisor on Transformation to the Chancellor of the City University of New York, CUNY. The author and editor of over 20 books, she has recently concentrated on the science of learning, including The New Education, How to Revolutionize the University to Prepare Students for a World in Flux, and co-authored with Christina Katapodis, The New College Classroom. Co-founder and co-director of HASTAC, she was appointed by President Obama to the National Council on the Humanities, co-directed the MacArthur Foundation's digital media and learning competitions, served on the board of directors of Mozilla, and twice keynoted the Nobel Prize Committee Forum on the Future of Learning. So with that introduction, I'll turn it over to Jade for a first question.
Thank you, Shelley and Kevin, for those introductions. They were absolutely wonderful, and I am so excited about this conversation. One of the things that I think is really important to note right now is it feels like AI is everywhere, and entering into these conversations feels like a really big and abundant thing that has no limits. So the question I would like to start with is, keeping in mind that AI is a huge category and it can mean so many things, are there any assumptions that you all are bringing to the conversation that the audience should be aware of as they're tuning in?
Do you want to start, Alondra, or should I dig in?
I don't know. Sure. Why don't you start, Cathy?
Okay. So my assumption is it's not new. That the term artificial intelligence was coined by John McCarthy in the 1950s. And we've been seeing iterations of AI over and over again. But certainly the generative AI in the form of ChatGPT, which was commercially launched a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, is bigger, more comprehensive, and more adopted and more seen I think one of the things about the history of technology is we all think things are either a dragon or a knight in shining armor. It's going to kill us all, or it's going to save us all. And then it becomes adopted and it kind of disappears and we forget it even existed. So we forget that things like autocorrect and so many of the things we take for granted on the internet, in fact, are using some form of artificial intelligence. So that's one thing I would say about my assumptions is we're seeing a new iteration. We're going to be seeing many, 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 many subsequent iterations. But this is something that's very much built in for better and for worse. And I know we'll talk about both because Alondra Nelson has been a leader in making us aware of these things. The infrastructure itself is something we'll be talking about, I'm sure, today.
Well, I would, of course, agree with Cathy. You would be foolish not to. So I share many of her same assumptions. And I want to just begin by thanking you all for hosting this conversation. Thank you, Shelley, for the introduction. Jade and Kevin for helping to wrangle this conversation. And I also just want to congratulate Cathy on 10 years of the Futures Initiative and decades more of just being such a leader and in the vanguard of this space and helping us to think about education, technology, and so much more. So congratulations, Cathy. It's really great to be in this conversation with you.
Thank you. And I'm sorry I came out so robot-like. I must admit I'm on the verge of tears. So I'm trying really hard not to be emotional, but I can't tell you how grateful I am to all of you. And Alondra, that you made time in your life to be here is
that you make time in your life to be here. Come on. I mean, you have built all of this, and we are here in your house, the house that you helped build with so many others. So
I second that.
So yes, huge category. I think, that's one of my assumptions is that I'm not only and always talking about large language models. I share with Cathy that the tools have been around much longer and that there are a lot more of them. At the same time, I also agree that when you say, both the challenge and the opportunity of this moment for if we care about more participation, more inclusion, and conversations about AI, is that, 4 years ago, if you had said AI, most people wouldn't have, it wouldn't have computed. They wouldn't have sort of had something that immediately came to mind. Now, as Cathy suggested, with the emergence of ChatGPT and commercial products that are consumer facing, and AI, now a lot more people know what you're saying or think they know what you're saying when you say AI, but they often mean a very narrow thing. So I often mean a much broader thing, but I also know that in conversations, with colleagues, with students, they're often talking about LLM. So I think we've got to be, careful about pivoting through those things. And I try to always bring to the conversation specificity about the tools, including what the product is. So if you're talking about LLMs, or you're talking about ChatGPT or Claude, or, Llama 3, these things they work differently. Or, are we talking about kind of basic automation tools, like autocorrect or, kind of narrow predictive analytics or, generative AI. And then I think it's always important to think about the context. So we'll be talking about, I think mostly education today. But even across the space of education, the differences between the potentials and dangers of various kinds of AI technologies for a K-12 context versus a university or college classroom are different. And then the last thing I would say is that I don't, another assumption, I think no one will be surprised to hear me say this, is that that the technology itself does not represent some advancement for education. But that's got to be demonstrated, proven, researched, et cetera.
Yes,
Thank you.
a follow-up question on that, which is you were sharing assumptions that you're bringing to the conversation, but can you be more specific about some surprising assumptions that you've encountered as you've been speaking to audiences across different industries and across the globe? Anything you've heard people say that you felt like you had to push back on?
Yeah, I'm kind of a one-woman brigade for, against technological determinism, like the technology is going to fix it. You put the tool in the classroom and, we're going to bridge, the chasm of educational inequality. So much of what we, part of it is the hype that comes out of, venture capital and companies about technologies. Part of it is the technologies are interesting and cool in some instances and maybe will allow us to do new things. But all of that together means that people say, technology equals an outcome that is better health, more education for more people, a greener planet and all of that. And all of that's got to be stewarded and demonstrated, tested. So I think I'm always, I think, trying to, push back, but also I think, as a kind of mentee of Troy Duster's, I'm often just trying to help people reframe. So I feel like they're given a choice architecture that says either you are for technology and say it's good, or you're against it, as opposed to being able to have any kind of complexity around it. And then I think, I've been sort of worried about watching lots of organizations, from businesses to institutions of higher education, feel that they have to quickly implement these pretty much untested, like not fully assessed tools, because they're being asked by their board of trustees or the board of director investors, like, what is your AI strategy? And they just have got to do something, even if it's not the case. So I worry about that assumption that somehow AI requires that we take some action, even if we're not sure it is one of these tools is the thing that might help us get the outcomes that we want as an organization.
Yeah, I would just add to that that yesterday I watched only a part of, I didn't have time to watch the whole thing, but a podcast by Cory Doctorow that was kind of riffing on and making fun of the fact that Google at one point had as its motto, "Don't be evil." Well, I mean, how naive can you be, right? Now that we've got this, Harari would call it global technological totalitarianism. Now, that may be the opposite, but somewhere in between, we have to have, and this is again the kind of thing that Alondra, you've been doing so powerfully, we have to have policies and structures and laws and infrastructures and safeguards and guardrails, which, as you've said many times, we already have. And they also can be applied, not only applied to AI and new technologies, but we might need new laws also that apply to them. That, of course, takes something. Harari says we need the World Cup for technology, something where all the nations of the world think, hey, it's only going to be fun and it's only going to be fair if we're all in this together and we all agree on the rules. And we're pretty far from a World Cup for AI right now, but it's a lovely little metaphor for the kind of collaborations and consolidations and agreements that really we do need going forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think extending that, I would say, I mean, the challenge is like, who gets to pull the red cards and the yellow cards, right? Like, so if we create, we're going to extend the football soccer metaphor, so we'll agree on the rules, but there's, who gets to call, the fouls and, throw people out of the game. I think we're grappling very much with that in the governance of AI.
Totally.
Can I ask you to pull the metaphor a little bit further?
That's all I know about soccer, Jade. I'm
sorry.
sorry.
I was going to ask what the goal was. I thought, I don't know if there is a goal yet, but that was what came to mind when you said that.
I'm kidding.
I would say the goalposts keep changing, though, that we don't know what the goal is, and the goal is changing. If the goal is people who in fact forgot that they weren't supposed to be evil and who really do want to ruling the world, that's a different goal than a goal that says, what can we do to make this as climate positive? I don't think it's ever going to be energy efficient, but it could be more efficient than it is. Not destroy labor relations entirely. Not build in a kind of resegregation of U.S. society and maybe even global society as well. Et cetera. Surveillance everywhere. All of those things. But I do think the goalposts are changing, and not everybody. And that's again the World Cup analogy. Not everyone shares the same goal. And whatever the rules are, and I can't tell you another rule either, if you don't have the same goal, nobody's going to win.
Yeah, I think that's right. And also, I mean, some of the goals are just antisocial and antithetical to being in the game, right? Like, so you can imagine, we're going to take this to the limits of our very knowledge of soccer, Cathy, I'm sure. But like, so there's like a side game, there's like the game that we're all at, and there's a side game where like all, the sort of rich people are with, they have the better seats and, all of that. And, they have different rules and different goals and aspirations, which are, capital accumulation, more power, control. Some of the leaders in technology and VC, I mean, like literally have, political philosophies about the world that, look quite different from, I think, some of the aspirations and norms that other of us hold. And so definitely moving goalposts, but also like there are people outside of the stadium or above the stadium or whatever who are trying to enact, a different kind of society.
I love that. Partially because then it makes me think, where are we? And in many ways, we're just the audience watching on TV at home.
No.
Yeah.
Yes, but we can't. We
I
gotta.
know. That's why we're talking today. So that's why I'm so
Right.
excited about the conversation.
Did you want to go ahead and ask the next
Sure.
question?
So you've already touched on this a little bit in talking about the soccer analogy, that I really like metaphors and analogies, so this is making me extremely happy. You mentioned the haves and the have-nots. So the next question, especially in an educational context, is at this point, do we have a sense of which groups are benefiting from AI, which groups are at risk for AI, which groups are invisible because of AI, and all of those wonderful things?
Ooh. So I'm gonna be a Pollyanna here because I can go through all the negatives so fast. I mean, clearly the people most wanting to and seemingly succeeding at capitalizing now are the tiny percentage of trillionaires who are accumulating more global capital than has ever been accrued to a small percentage of people globally in all human history. When people talk about Elon Musk being the richest human in all human history, that's just, I mean, it's kind of, you can't even grasp what that means. And that the goal is to get more. I mean, what? I mean, you really literally could solve global poverty just by making wealthy people, a little less vastly wealthy people. So we know that. I'm going to try to talk about something a little more positive. This week I was talking to one of our former Futures Initiative fellows, Chris McGinnis, who's an ethnomusicologist, also a computer scientist, who said, I said, I need to come up with something positive before I'm on this webinar because I hate being the person who only has gloom and doom. And he said, have you been on a Huggy Face? I'm like, what is Hugging Face? And he said, you know that emoji, the little emoji of the hugging face? He said, there's a company that has started an open access AI developers forum for research and developers. And they're using that emoji, the hugging face emoji, because they want to welcome everybody into an open source community to not only develop new kinds of open source code, but many of these people were some of the original developers of ChatGPT. They were there, they know what's inside that black box, and they're using that knowledge to now study what's going on and to reveal on an extremely knowledgeable technical way what is happening in the black box in order that better policies can be made. So one of the most recent ones is there's only, ChatGPT is about 100 million users. Hugging Face has 1.2 million, has 50,000 registered, 1.2 million and one, because I registered now on Hugging Face. And had a great time playing in the sandboxes. There are many sandboxes you can play in at different levels. And about 50,000 organizations. One of the things they have discovered is the fact that ChatGPT is set up to be what's often called sycophantish, which means to tell the user they're great, to tell the user everything they're doing is wonderful. In fact, is almost an cognitively addictive drug that lets people get very grandiose feelings about themselves. Rolling Stone had an article very recently, maybe this week or last week, about people who are convinced they're prophets and saviors because when they ask ChatGPT questions about themselves, ChatGPT says, yes, you are a god, and really reinforces that and will feed them information to enforce delusion. So in fact, in the most recent ChatGPT model, the 4.0 model that was rolled out just a few days ago, they have dialed back the sycophantishness. That's great, right? That there are people that can document what happens by a certain kind of programming that we think is inevitable, but in fact is very, very much scripted, and to think about the consequences and get people to dial it back. It was also interesting to me that when Greg Brockman revealed ChatGPT 4.0, he said, hey, no one should be using code without testing it first. Well, that's interesting because you don't learn how to test AI without doing a whole lot of work. So the other magic that they're trying to that many of the commercial companies are trying to sell is you don't have to work anymore. It'll do all your work for you. Well, that also means you lose the agency of knowing how things work so that you can then be a resistor against things that are working against you. But all of that cycle and that the fact that Hugging Face exists gives me great hope. People are calling it a GitHub for AI, an open source developer source and community for AI. And it's tiny, again, 1.2 million users, but I'm going to broadcast it everywhere I can. It gave me a different kind of hope than I've had in a long time about possibilities for really knowledgeable people giving us the tools we need so that people like Alondra who are doing policy can actually be as effective as they possibly can. And on a level that doesn't get dismissed by the techno geeks who like to dismiss anybody they can as not being really, really knowledgeable about what they do.
And
And happy soapbox.
Yeah, I mean, I love the sort of conversation about Hugging Face. I'm also a big admirer of the work that they do. I think, but we've also learned lessons, I think, from the open source sort of, movement culture that, sort of preceded the contemporary AI moment. So certainly we know that those with existing privileged, who have access to technology will benefit, I think, the most, Jade, from this moment. So students with, high-speed internet access, with, the latest smartphones, who are generally kind of digitally skilled, who have, educational backgrounds that ask them to kind of ask, critical questions about the world. And then you might add, I think, given, Cathy's really important point about open source and Hugging Face, like people who have both the skills and the confidence to want to work in that open source community. And I think we've learned from like the earlier open source software space. There's a wonderful researcher at Microsoft Research named Danae Robinson Ford, who's been doing research on this over the last few years. And, it helps us to think about the culture of open source communities. So for example, you have a GitHub account and you're creating open source software, you've created some code and you want other people to pick it up and use it. There is still homophily in the use of these tools, right? So you're likely to sort of work with your social network. Tools and code in the open source space is more likely to be used or picked up if men create it rather than women. So we still have these sort of challenges. Once you get across that, because open source is also like a peer learning community. So who gets to learn from who gets to be considered, innovators in a community like Hugging Face or in a community like GitHub. So I think we've got those challenges, but it is the case, right? I mean, I'm probably a little bit less Pollyannish than Cathy. There are like incredible things are amazing, are being made possible. So, what people are starting to call vibe coding, right? Which is like, you don't have to know how to code like many of us were taught. And, depending on your, age cohort, junior high school, college, and your discipline, we're taught to code. So that's a tremendous opportunity. And if you add to that the open source piece of it, like you're looking at a near future in which most anyone who wants to write code will be able to do so in some ability. It does open a really interesting question, though, for teachers, right? And I think for me, all paths, I think, lead when we're thinking about the university space to what it means to help students develop critical thinking skills, regardless of the discipline that they're studying. So even in fields like computer science and engineering, if you no longer have to learn how to code in a way that you used to, what then are you teaching in the classroom? Like, are you teaching how to debug? Are you teaching syntax? And in the space of, computer science, those are effectively critical thinking skills, right? How do you think about the problem? Or how do you think about problems and trying to sort of solve puzzles? The other thing I would say is, we do have lessons, particularly in the K-12 space, from ed tech that I think that we should, take seriously here. And I would love to see you know, we just need a lot more research. So we don't yet know exactly what, you know, so Cathy mentioned the, you know, sycophancy. So we have some research that's coming out of the AI labs. We have some that's coming out of, you know, independent research, but it's really only the beginning, in part because so many of these tools are released without full testing or without, you know, third-party independent testing. We're seeing with some of the new model releases, I think both with Google and with OpenAI, with one of its O model releases, that they didn't do, you know, they didn't publish a systems card or any kind of research about, you know, and even that was a sort of pretty low threshold. And, you know, we're not even getting that with these more recent releases. So I think we need to worry about that. And then I think, let me wind up by just saying the ed tech thing. I mean, you know, we had a movement around a computer in every classroom. It was pretty technologically determinist, you know, and we kind of thought if every kid had, you know, a computer, that they were somehow going to, you know, it was going to sort of bridge, as I said, this kind of chasm of educational inequality. So there were some great outcomes. It is generally, you know, a value add to have these powerful technologies for young people. But then you've got all sorts of other problems, like, you know, the obsolescence that the market builds into these computers in every classroom. So if you can't afford to update the software because the contract expires, then you've got, you know, accounts of computers stacked up in the corner in classrooms because the school district, you know, can't afford to buy the licenses to sort of upgrade the software. And, you know, obsolescence has been built in such that they can't even use the old software. So, you know, I think there are lots of you know, kind of systemic and institutional challenges that we face, in addition to, I think, certain groups that we could predict without doing research who might, you know, benefit or not benefit. Last thing I would say, I'm on the board of the Innocence Project, and so I'm thinking quite a lot about these tools, not only for elites, like probably most of us on the call, like, you know, not 1%, but, you know, fairly well educated. But I'm also thinking about, you know, people who are, you know, coming out of the prison, out of jail, involvement with the criminal legal system. And, you know, one, I think I'll end with a positive point, given Cathy's gesture for us to be thinking bigger about this, is, you know, to be able to use, you know, a large language model to create a resume and a cover letter, you know, to not have to deal with tabs and like formatting and all of this, to sort of use a chatbot to do that for someone who is trying to re-enter the workforce, at a time when entering the workforce means being able to load things up to Indeed or LinkedIn or whatever. I mean, that's significant. That's hugely significant. And that was something that, you know, this same group of people maybe couldn't have done 2 years ago, and would have had to write by hand the cover letter, do all the formatting to have a resume that sort of met a bar that would get you to that conversation, so you could tell your story, and talk about why you would be, you know, great in this role that an organization's hiring for.
Right.
So the next question I had, I think you've both started edging in this direction, but I'll ask the question and see if you want to clarify anything. And the question is, how do you see AI changing higher education in particular? And the second part is, do you think those changes are permanent? And maybe I'll tweak that a little bit and say, if there are aspects of change underway that are not yet set in stone, what are the things that you think we need to address before they do become permanent?
Wow. So we know, and Alondra, I love it that you keep referring back to what we know, right? We're old. I think everyone on this screen is old enough to have remembered a before. Our students don't, right? I mean, we have fellows who were born in 2000. So it was April 22nd, 1993, that the two professors from the National Center for Supercomputing Applications came out and held up one piece of notebook paper and said, We are giving you the world's greatest gift. We're going to make all of the world's websites available to all of you for free. And it literally all the websites in the world fit on one piece of paper. That was Dan Reed and Larry Samar, who were very helpful when we created HASTAC. But we remember that before, and we remember the time before cell phones and all of that. And we know that many of the promises and the things that we said were going to happen turned out to not be big. I mean, certainly most of us remember the MOOC moment, massive online open courseware. I was one of the first people that was asked to teach a future of higher education on a Coursera MOOC. And I said, sure, but I'm only going to do it if I can do it as active learning. And we had a face-to-face group of about 18 students. And I think Jade was one of the doctoral students who was part of the face-to-face group.
Yes.
And we did open learning with 18,000 people from around the world and did hackathons and calls, and the face-to-face students kept office hours 24/7. It was amazing. Is that what the model of the MOOC is now? Of course not. The MOOCs are just the cheapest form of one old-fashioned traditional, what is the term that Free Air uses, you know, where you just dump things into the student's head and they just passively take knowledge and then answer a test at the end. You know, so there was lots of blue sky. There were people trying to think about blue sky educational uses. And then there were other people who were trying to say, no, no, no. You need to do this because it's going to be fast. It's going to be easy. You know, get people through the system fast. The other day on Blue Sky, I saw this beautiful quote, and I'm going to read it because all the wording is great. It's by Alexander Chi, the writer Alexander Chi, who wrote, this is a direct quote, "This will sound weird, but love yourself enough to write your own term papers." I love that sense because it says basically, you know, yeah, you can do it the easy way and you can have ChatGPT write your term paper, or you can pay $300 and have somebody in Nigeria who's writing term papers for people, you know, for another form of cheating. Cheating was not invented by ChatGPT. Somebody, a famous media person, was saying, I feel like an old guard because people never cheated when I was in student. I was really? When I was in school, all the athletes had their girlfriends write their term papers for you. Come on, come on, get over it. At the same time, the thing that she is saying is, you know, if you really want to be a citizen of the world, if you really want to prosper in the world, not just have a degree, but to be really successful in your life outside of school, there's certain things you have to learn. You don't practice for a marathon by driving your car 10 miles a day. I mean, you just are never going to develop those muscles. So one of the things that bothers me about educational technology that is way too rapidly being bought at very great cost, and there's always a trade-off. If you're spending millions of dollars on AI, that means you're not spending millions of dollars on something else, especially in the strapped condition of public higher education now. But if you're doing that so students can get away from learning, that seems like a terrible, terrible failure. At the same time, if in your classroom you're acting like a robot, you might as well be one. Right? I mean, if you're a teacher who teaches one-way learning and acts like a computer screen, might as well do it in an automated way. So I think this is a challenge in both directions, that we need better interactive technologies. We also need better ways, and I think, Alondra, you alluded to this, better ways of teaching that use these technologies for creative, inspiring, challenging ways that set the bar higher, not lower, so that learners really can be learning and inspiring us all. And you know, if you do that, and especially if you let students take the lead, they're going to teach you lots more about ChatGPT than you'll ever be able to teach them. I don't know about you, but I go on TikTok and I'm learning, whoa, crazy new things you can do with ChatGPT every day from 15-year-olds on TikTok. So, you know, it's we can all learn from that. And that's more important than just spending millions of dollars on a out-of-the-box technology that can't be modified in any way and that is based on a very old-fashioned unidirectional learning model.
Right. Yeah, I agree with all of that, Cathy. I would also say, just in the spirit of the reframing I mentioned earlier, you know, we are now being asked to be, you know, US society, American society, global society, to be guinea pigs for technology companies that release products without, you know, information around them, you know, a surprise, without letting people know. So I just want us to imagine that there could have been a release of ChatGPT in November of 2022 that had been released after it had taken time, a couple weeks, a month, one's not asking for, years and years to engage teachers unions, to engage public school teachers, to engage college university teachers, to say, this is coming out. We've worked with some of you to create some discussion manuals, some tools for how you might use them. I mean, I'm talking about very bare bones stuff here. I'm not talking about deep, rich curricula for an entire semester. Instead, we got, because of the market logic and because of wanting to get it out before other companies, a product that was released that sent people into a kind of panic, right? So we had school districts banning ChatGPT. We have colleges and universities still figuring out how to use it. And I think we would have still been in that place, but we could have just imagined, if we think about OpenAI, that has now had to, double down and confirm that is a public benefit company and a nonprofit, right? That is supposed to have some public good benefit to what it does. A release of these powerful, cool, in some instances, helpful new tools that just gave us a bit more preparation, right? And that didn't put teachers back on their heels and then automatically make students cheaters. And then, then we get the AI version of Turnitin, which is wrong and misidentifying people. I mean, there's press accounts of all of that. So we could have just asked for a little bit more strategy about this. If the goal is what people say it is to have a better educational system, right? That's the kind of thing you do if you want that outcome. So I really am just still quite grumpy about that 2 years on, because we could have, with not a lot of work, could have imagined a kind of different rollout. So I guess I would go back to the sort of initial question I think that Jade asked us, which is what are you thinking about when you think about AI? So if we're only thinking about, I think, large language models in the classroom, then, it also, I think, leaves us a lot more focused on, students, quote unquote, cheating with writing, which I would love to just problematize a little bit with writing assignments. I think it really falls to us as teachers to think about how we're going to do these assignments. I mean, because there are ways that you can use these models in the classroom if you want to, right? So there are ethical questions about, use of natural resources, about the companies themselves, right? So it is a completely legitimate, I think, ethical position for a teacher, professor to say, I'm not using these tools in my classroom at all, right? But if you don't take those positions and want to try to use them, I think there are kind of interesting examples. So we know large language models are often wrong. I mean, I've done some work with Julia Engwin. The little test that we did is, at least 50% of the, accuracy when you're asking for factual information. So how do you engage students in sort of identifying how they're wrong, right? I mean, it feels to me that it's a little bit of a parallel moment. And, 20 years ago or something, 10 years, when Wikipedia was introduced, and it's turned out to be a very useful tool, but many of us were worried because you were just how do we prove that this is true? And are students getting very wrong information? So how do you engage students in learning to identify and building their critical thinking muscles by being is this true or not true? How do you chase down this citation to find out if it's true? How do you follow back this hyperlink to find out if it's true? So I think engage them in doing some of that work. A friend, Paul Aum, who teaches in the law school at Georgetown, allows students to use ChatGPT for their or large chatbots for their writing, but you can't go back but you can't cite it, right? So how do you allow new kind of practices to use them? So what Professor Aum does is ask students to print out the prompt and the answer, and they attach that to the back of the paper. And so that allows them to cite, because there's no way that one of us as a teacher, professor who's evaluating that could go to the same chatbot and say, how did they get this information? So that's one example. And then I think I just want to double, triple click on what Cathy said about, we don't even know the potential use cases. And part of what we're going to learn is from the students. And so I don't want to tamp down whatever it is they with their super I still marvel at literal, like not even toddlers, like 9-month-old babies, like swiping iPads, or like whatever, like they are just not like us, right? They just have grown up in a world that like never had a corded telephone and always had the internet. And, now, we'll be teaching in 10 years or 15 years, students who have always had generative AI. And so I think we need to be, have some humility around what we can learn from them about how these might be used. And I worry that, cheating being our sort of primary framework for thinking about this sort of, although it is a significant problem, it makes it a little bit harder for us to try to see what might be possible.
If I can just add on that, I'd love to. We lost a wonderful scholar and friend recently. Jonathan Stern is a media scholar who wrote on all
Yes.
kinds of aspects of media, had cancer for 10 years, and then wrote a beautiful book about disability when he actually lost his own voice and then created a voice box that allowed him to speak. And he taught at McGill University, where we sometimes have 250 or 400 students in a class. He gave multiple choice exams, and he was the best pedagogue ever. And so he would constantly study ways to try to make this impersonal way of lecturing more impersonal. And one thing he came up with that he did year after year was he'd let students make a cheat sheet. They could come into the class with one, and he always gave different specs because he was a clever guy, and he actually did an art installation once of all the cheat sheets from one of his classes. So one year it might be an index card that you could write on both sides. One year you could not use color. Another year you could use color. And he would let students bring that cheat sheet into the class, and they would then answer as a final exam a very boring A, B, C, D, none of the above kind of exam, and they would hand in their cheat sheets. And it would teach him how people learned, how people, he learned so much from those cheat sheets. Were Jonathan alive now for a million reasons, but one of them is I know he would be doing something where right now one of his classes would be having to do physical cheat sheets, and another one would be allowed to have a one-page cheat sheet from ChatGPT that they didn't do themselves, and he would look at the grades. And I would love to know that. In other words, what he knew, what was implied in his method, was he knew the ABCD part. We've had studies of that go back to the 1880s. If you know you're having a final exam, you lose the content you studied for that exam within 3 weeks after the exam. 75% of it is gone, right? It goes into short-term memory. You know it's not useful. It's gone. But when you do that thing of synthesizing everything you learned in a course and putting it on a one-page note card that's going to help you pass an exam, that's an incredible method of reinforcing all the forms of cognition that we know are useful. I would love to see a parallel to how much we're losing cognitively if we're not using that kind of that method of synthesis, understanding, putting things in our own words. I am going to use red because red makes me think about things. All of those very tactile ways that allow us to learn against obstacles. That versus doing it automated. What are we learning? There's so many different ways not to learn. I want to know what we're not learning by using something like ChatGPT in the process of getting to our terrible system now of so much determination by outcomes of who or when we aren't successful in the classroom. We put so much, without artificial intelligence, we put so much emphasis on an outcome that it's no surprise that people want to shortchange the process and get to that outcome faster.
Yeah, I think I would love also to know what Jonathan would have to say about this. So he's missed in that way and so many more, Cathy, as you say. I would also want to add to the mix, like, that's the way we learn. I'm not a learning sciences person. And so if there's anybody who's on the call, like, add a question or something, because that's just not, it's not what I do. But I think I have lots of questions about that. So I know that I learn and think by writing, and and that's paper and red pens and green pens and highlighters and all of that. But we also live in a world in which, if we think about the Poynter Institute data or Pew Research Center data, that most people get information orally.
Right.
And that was that was the very first learning technology. That was the first way that we communicated. So I don't know, I'm not making a case here. I don't know what the answer is, because I think we need to actually find out. But we have, if we're thinking about young people in particular, they don't think like, I mean, like if I'm trying to figure out, like I have something like, where is the manual for my printer or whatever? Like I will go to Google and say like manual brother H22 or whatever, you know. People younger than us are just going to go to YouTube or go to TikTok. Like it doesn't even occur to them to like find a printed manual. And I've also been hearing from some colleagues how, you know, students are uploading articles to Notebook LLM, which, you know, converts written text to like a podcast format. So we know that there's a little bit of inaccuracy. So the technology will, you know, you've got to be, it's a tough one for students because it's great if you already know the topic.
Right.
And it helps you learn the topic in a different way. But if you don't already know the topic, you're not going to be able to identify, unless you create it as a task for a classroom, what's wrong and not wrong. But what we know is that a lot of young people say, I learn better hearing people talk to me about this PDF from the Journal of the American, you know, American Studies Association, rather than reading the article. And I think as teachers, that's what we want.
Right.
You know, I guess the question is it also building critical learning capacity? And I don't know. And I think they might say yes. I don't know, you know, but I want to be open to people not learning like us and trying to figure out if that's, you know, possible and what that means.
Right. And of course, in the 18th century, to go back to kind of my own historical roots, people thought learning to read and learning by reading mass printed books was a very impoverished way of learning. Or learning orally from somebody else was the model of learning. And people thought we were going to go to hell in a handbasket once people could read lots of books and cheap print. So in some ways, there's a kind of a full.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. This is, it's making me think of your comment earlier, Alondra, about technological determinism and how those are built into those systems, because I think in many ways classrooms are also deterministic.
Mhm.
And as you two were talking, the thing that I kept going back to is how it's being framed as cheating. And it made me think, Alondra, of when you talk about policies around AI and how we already have so many policies that apply there because we weren't part of the beginning conversation in education around this. It feels like we've landed at a place where it's moved faster than we can keep up. And so we have to rely on those tools that we had, which is absolutely fascinating. And actually brings me to one of the other questions that I had, which is around the debate around AI technology and how we frame it, because the conversation still feels like it's primarily between technologists and policymakers and not university policymakers, global policymakers. And we're sort of getting it at the tail end while doing this massive testing that you mentioned, because all of these things are commercially available and free to use. Obviously, you can pay to be more protected and have other things. But all that to say, I'm wondering where educators and students fit into this discussion. Like, where are the spots where it makes sense to be engaged?
Yeah, it's a really important question. And I think one of the things I try to convey to colleagues constantly is that, you know, you don't have to be an AI expert to have an informed opinion and an empowered perspective and stance on, you know, these tools and systems and what they mean in the world. And, you know, I think in the first instance, it's also that it's too often the case that, you know, very powerful people in the technology space, for example, try to crowd out other opinions, including policymakers, right? By saying, if you're not that one, you know, person in the House of Representatives who has a master's degree in computer science, you couldn't possibly make efficacious, you know, good AI policy. Like, don't, you know, get out of here. Don't even like try to be in the conversation. And so, you know, we all know from other kinds of work, the kind of power and the way that ideas about expertise can be both leveraged and weaponized to exclude lots of other voices. And I think when you're looking at something like AI, which some people claim is, my God, on the brink of sentience, like how could we mere mortals like possibly have anything to say about this? And so we have just got to reject that framework, you know, outright. And it also, I think, becomes important for thinking about use case, this is all why it's all the more important to think about use cases and outcomes, right? So if you're thinking about like AI in the abstract, if you're thinking about, dense layers of neural networks, or something, then, of course you might not have anything on the expert level to say about that. But if you are talking about how AI tools and systems can and should be used or not in school systems to help with learning outcomes for young people, all of us have something to say about that, right? Including young people, educators, teachers, taxpayers, And so, when I was working in Washington, you mentioned in the introduction, kindly, Kevin, that I had worked on a project called the Blueprint for the AI Bill of Rights. And partly what we tried to do with that project, which has a subtitle that's something like making automated systems work for the American public. So it is addressed to the public. It is not addressed to other policymakers. It's not addressed to technologists. And the process was really spending almost a year talking to, we wrote an op-ed in Wired that had an email address that went to the White House. So anyone who wanted, to write to us could. You'll love this. We had what we called office hours, where everybody working on the policy team had to set aside, I think it was like Tuesday from 3 to 4 or something, or Tuesday for, maybe it's 2 hours. And we just took appointments with anybody who contacted us who wanted to have something to say. We obviously talked to, technology companies and technology company researchers, lots of academic researchers. But we also talked to high school students and, rabbis, literally. We talked to just a large swath of people about what they wanted these technologies to do and be, or not do and be, in their lives. And we also took a lot of time to convert. So, you could have imagined an AI policy document that was literally all about technical things, the difference between, ChatGPT and GPT-4, like, what are those? And this is really about the outcomes, like that, that you should, if these technologies are going to be used, you should know. Here are some examples how we can do that technically. If they're going to be used to make a consequential decision about you, whether or not you should be in this class or that class, whether or not you're going to be able to go on to, this university program or not, get this job, get this mortgage, that you should be able to have some recourse and say something about it. So it was and then we go back to the technology and say, what's technically possible and feasible, having talked to some of the best technologists, to get this outcome, which is the outcome that the public wants, as opposed to saying like, what's the technology, do the thing. It's like, what is the outcome? What's the aim? And then what are the technological means to get there? And if we don't have them, what research, what innovation needs to take place to get there? So I think, I know I'm being a little bit long-winded, but for me, it's like, that means not only should educators and students be central to the conversations and not peripheral, they can be central. And, and that's a strategy for thinking about that. We know that AI systems are going to have, I think, profound impacts on teaching and learning, some that we want and maybe some that we don't want. And so I think bringing students, because they've got, as we've already discussed, as Cathy and I have both raised, have incredibly valuable perspectives and also just ways of thinking, just a schema for thinking about the use of these tools, a more intuitive understanding of these tools than any of us, I think most of us on this call will ever have. And in some ways, their generation into the future will be the kind of cohort of people most directly affected by the implementation of these tools. This is their, adult life, future life, if we're thinking about high school students. So it's not only possible, I think it's smart for policymaking to engage, different perspectives. And then I think there's this generation piece that's really just going to be really important because, we just have, generationally, we have blind spots. Obviously, technologists have blind spots. Higher ed and, college, university or K-12 administrators have blind spots. And so I think not just because it's sort of good, to be more participatory and inclusive, but it's also good for better policy to engage more people in these debates.
Cathy?
I don't really have anything to add to that. I thought that was just exactly and perfect. the only thing is a story, an anecdote. I used to teach a class called This Is Your Brain on the Internet, where the final paper had to be, I used to require that they wrote their final project not using any technology created after April 22nd, 1993, and then brought in the technology, the ancient technology they found that they thought was the most amazing. And people would bring in like those old IBM Selectric typewriters, you know, those huge things that had this little ball. People would bring in phones that you listen to, and you know, someone brought in an AM radio and said, you know, and there was a time when you never even got to hear a song unless it was on the radio, some DJ somewhere was playing your song.
Imagine that.
Imagine that, you know, it was really, and people would wait for their song to be played on the radio. I mean, it was a really great thing. I would love to be teaching a class like now, where we had part of the class using all the AI resources they possibly could and one not, and then actually comparing what you learn and don't learn and how you learn. I think the how you learn might even be more important than the what you learn. How you learn if you use those resources and don't, and use that to come up with things. And I absolutely agree that students would do a much better job at that than most of us, no matter how much book knowledge we have about thinking and learning and cognition. They think they would do a much better job at the textures of what you learn and don't learn, and how you learn and don't learn differently, using those technologies and not using those technologies, or which technologies and how you use those technologies, and in what parts of your life. It would be a fascinating thing to see. And I think we don't really know what the future is. We don't really know how much these things are going to be absorbed in life and to what end and how they'll be used. The politics of that, and again, I defer to you, Alondra, on this, but the policy and politics of that are in some ways so much more consequential than the actual technology itself. I mean, are they going to be used for surveillance? Are they going to be used so that nobody can move or do anything without surveillance?
That was going to be my next question,
Please.
but just as a time check, we have about 5 minutes left. So if you
Excellent.
want to ignore this question and there's things that you want to say before the time is up, please ignore the question. But here's the question, since you mentioned surveillance. And the question is, as we have seen in recent bipartisan hearings in Congress, platforms for discussion and expression can also be used as tools of censorship and surveillance. So given the special challenges that U.S. universities face at the moment, how can we make sure that new tools are adopted in ways that protect creative expression and open discussion while avoiding the potential for censorship and surveillance?
Yeah, I mean, this is a huge question, and I think the first answer, and I'm going to be quick here, is embodied in the question, Kevin, which is to say, we've got to be very honest about the fact that these tools do both these things, or all of these things, this full spectrum of things. And when you have large language models, it gets, I think, the policy space gets a little tricky because, you know, we're told, although we should not buy this because it's not been proven out, that they are general purpose technologies, right? So if you can't possibly know to what purpose they might be used, you know, you worry about placing a policy around them or constraints around them that might constrain some of the good uses or the bad uses. However, I think if we, as I was trying to suggest, shift to that use case and shift to the outcome, then you are not thinking, you know, you can say, okay, this tool can be used for surveillance, and it can also be used, if we're thinking about facial recognition technology, as it has been used to identify people who've been trafficked, and, you know, and restore them to their communities, for example. But the larger gesture here, the larger of a lot of these tools and technologies, and AI in particular, is more information about more people, more powerfully at scale. And to me, you know, that is always going to tilt into, you know, the authoritarian, the surveillant, and the danger is there. And it's more acute, I think, than some prior technologies. The concerns for young people, if you're going to use these kinds of technologies in K to 12, having their information and data captured very early on in their life in these tools and technologies are deeply concerning. But we have nothing right now. We don't have we don't have any policy, and we keep hearing, don't overregulate, don't staunch the innovation, but we've actually not even tried, right? We've not even tried to put kind of reasonable rules in place that would protect young people, I saw in the Washington Post this morning that Senator Markey and a Republican senator from Louisiana are asking the question about facial recognition technology and in transportation at airports. Like we just have to sort of move forward with all of this accumulation of people's data without sort of asking the question. So being willing to just ask that question as well. And I know we're running out of time. I'm going to use my last utterance to say the following. Cathy Davidson, thank you for giving so much to people over your entire career, for being an institutional builder, for being a higher ed administration leader. I mean, people don't appreciate how hard that work is. And I think right now watching, presidents kind of struggle with that work, it's a very difficult job. And to do it in a way that you have done it across your career, that has been enabling of others, that it's been creating institutions that have co-leadership, co-authorship, that engage people. The reason that we are all here, the reason that HASTAC, I think I was a HASTAC fellow many years ago, continues, the reason that the Futures Initiative is celebrating its 10th anniversary is because you are and have been a leader that enables and that shares and that does it with great humility and vision. So thank you.
Needless to say, I'm destroyed. I don't know how I
Oh.
can add to that except to say thank you so much. And thank you, Jade and Kevin. Thanks to everybody behind the scenes that made this possible. A lot of people make this possible. And Alondra, thank you so much. That was really deeply moving. And I look forward to many future conversations. And needless to say, you are all exemplars of exactly the traits you so generously attributed to me. So thank you all. Really, really fantastic.
No, this has been absolutely wonderful. And obviously we are at time. But I wanted to thank both of you for the conversation. This could have gone on for 12 hours and I would have been having a ball, and I'm sure all the listeners would too. I'm going to hand it over to Shelley now to close us out because I am also destroyed because I have the same sentiments of Alondra. Thank you, Cathy. We are all here because you have been so amazingly supportive and wonderful. And I'm so grateful to have been a part of this conversation with all of you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hello. There's not much more to add, except to say thank you all for attending. And thank you so much, Cathy. Thank you, Alondra Nelson, for making time to be with us today. Kevin Healey and Jade Davis for your fantastic questions. If you want to learn more about HASTAC, about the Futures Initiative, or if you'd like to join us for the Future of Higher Education conversation with some more very distinguished institutional leaders, please join us at 6:30. You can learn all about that at futuresinitiative.org. Thank you so much. Thank you for coming. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Alondra, thank you.
Thank
Kat.
you.